right, everybody, welcome to this week's theme, which is a continuation of our big three flow triggers. Last week we concentrated on rich environment, and this week we're going to move right on in to deep embodiment, which is obviously one of the most fun ones there is. Out of the three subsets for deep embodiment, we're going to talk about embodied cognition, literally what does it mean to train our bodies and brains together, intrinsic motivation, and hedonic engineering. So let's take it from the top. The first one is embodied cognition, and for anybody that has had the chance to read Stealing Fire, and in Stealing Fire in particular, we actually lay this out explicitly, which is the notion that how we train our bodies directly informs our brains, and those two things together directly inform our minds and hearts. So we are not just heads on sticks. We are not just 3 pounds of gray matter between the ears, thinking, cogitating, executing, and ruminating. We are actually a whole system. And for some strange reason that I'm continuing to be baffled by, somehow steakhead jocks sort of claimed the high ground on what does it mean to exercise or be fit or any of these things. And that is, I think, one of the more destructive kind of social norms that we have left unchallenged today. The reality is it doesn't matter what we look like. It doesn't matter what the shape of our bodies is. It doesn't matter how old or how young we are. And it sure as hell doesn't matter what we look like in Lululemon tights. What it does matter is that we are humans and we are built to move. And when we move consciously and deliberately, we actually improve the neural networks in our brain. We take the narrow bandwidth of just thinking about stuff and turn it from dial-up to broadband, where we are sensing, thinking, feeling, and perceiving on all channels available to us as a metabolic life form, and we get to have a lot more fun. So the first thing to think about is, okay, we are drawing these particular flow triggers, the rich environment, deep embodiment, and high consequence, specifically from the action and adventure sport community. And for those guys, they have really focused in on this. No surprise, they're athletes. And there are 3 subsets of what does it mean to be embodied that these guys have specifically gone searching for, and that is what we will call the kind of the nectar of embodiment, which is 0 Gs, meaning experiences of weightlessness, multiple Gs, so experiences of extreme heaviness or loading, and polyaxial rotation, meaning I take, basically ass over tea kettle is the technical term, but fundamentally when I take my head and I rotate it around my hips in multiple planes of motion. If you think about surfers who carve big bottom turns at the bottom of a wave, that is weightedness. And then if you see them float off the top of a wave and then do some kind of crazy aerial, that's weightlessness. The same with skiers who will both turn around. If you look at Lindsey Vonn or Michaela Schifrin just railing a turn, right? That feels awesome. It also looks spectacular. And then they go over a rollover and they're flying in the air, right? Those kind of things are powerfully stimulating to our vestibular system and our proprioception. So a vestibular system is basically where is our inner ear in relationship to our center of gravity, or sort of just behind our belly button to hips. So where am I in space? Proprioception is arms and legs, and where are my arms and legs in relationship to my torso? And astronauts train in this kind of stuff, athletes train in this kind of stuff. The rest of us are usually chronically underdeveloped in those 2 skills. So if we think about our 5 senses, and we talk about going from dial-up to broadband, adding vestibular awareness and adding proprioception is at least a couple more senses that we get to kind of bring online and really make worthwhile. And when we think about it, right, you think about athletes and artists who have mastered this. Think about Mikhail Baryshnikov, the dancer, or Michael Jordan, the basketball player, or these days Steph Curry, or some of those other. I think Jordan was a little bit more dynamic and poetic in his movements. We pay huge sums of money just to see somebody else pull this off, right? We are in awe of people who have nullified the consequences of gravity, who appear to float, who appear to glide, who appear to dance, spin, pivot in these ways. And it's profound, powerful, and really beautiful. And so those things all really not only are they rewarding and satisfying, they actually serve as priming flow triggers. And North Face athlete and world-renowned, Sundance awarded filmmaker and friend of FGP, Jimmy Chin, had basically said that those three things, weightlessness, weightedness, and rotation, are the nectar of gravity games. They're the thing that keeps coming back, and they're the thing that draws those athletes into those prompts. So how on earth can you get those without busting your ass? Well, that's a great question, and that is literally why we're in the Flow Dojo and exactly what we've been attempting to do, which is that's hard if you're not a pro athlete. It's hard if you're not sponsored by Red Bull or you're not a trained gymnast and those kind of things. And like me personally, I just wanted a chance to try the coolest stuff without running a risk of ending up in the hospital. And so that's kind of what we've done, is creating specific training environments where we get to play in gyroscopes, we get to play in looping swings, we get to play in surf swings and all these kind of things where we can suspend the consequences of gravity and learn to play fearlessly. Now, that said, not everybody can get here, not everybody can train with us at once. We are going to be rolling out living room flow dojos. Here's what you can do and create and buy for yourself, so you can set it up in your garage, you can literally setting it up in your own living room, etc. So we support this stuff. In the meantime, consider looking into your local gymnastics or cheer facility. Consider diving boards and swimming pools. Consider just starting with acro yoga or regular yoga with inversions and postures, so you can always get access to some of this someplace near you. And just stay tuned with us, and we'll be putting out as much information as we can, both virtually and physically, to come and train and play more. So the next one from embodied cognition is intrinsic motivation. And one of the things that happens when we are deeply embodied, this goes back to Jimmy's comment about those three sensations being the nectar of gravity games, that's what keeps those athletes coming back. Right? The notion of intrinsic motivation is profound and has huge implications for how we educate, how we deal with elders, how we motivate employees, how we create sustainable lives for ourselves. Because if you think about it, and you even check the self-help bookshelves, we've got Malcolm Gladwell and his book Outliers, talking about 10,000 hours to mastery. We've got Charles Duhigg and his Power of Habit. We've got Angela Duckworth and her book Grit. And all those share this kind of shared theme that, like, hard work, dedication, like grinding it out, Napoleon Hill or Tony Robbins, whatever you believe you can achieve, there's a sense, and it's uniquely, exceptionally American, but is now pervasive around the world, which is this pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and that you can succeed by sheer force of will. And the realities is that there are cracks in that system. That's not necessarily how it goes. And when we do get to experience flow, the technical term for it that Csikszentmihalyi coined is that flow states, because of the reward neurochemistry, because of how good it feels to be freed from our inner critic and immersed in the now and receiving additional information that we normally don't access, because of all of those things happening at once, flow is autotelic. That just means it has its own reason or justification for doing. And the examples we often use, you can think about like kids staying out until the sun, long after the sun is down on a snow day, sledding, their hands are freezing cold, they haven't eaten anything since lunchtime, but they are just 7 shades of fired up to keep sledding. You can think about the computer coders that get into a coding jam and are up until 4 a.m. just banging away on code because they're so stoked to see this thing rock out. There are so many examples where people, when they're given permission to drop into a flow state, blow past anything that grit, motivation, right, goal setting, all those things would have otherwise done. And case in point is fundamentally, dirtbags, ski bums, surf bums, all those folks, they weren't top of their class in school. They probably didn't ever take the trash out on time when they were kids. Most of them are like delivering pizzas or washing dishes or doing something just to be near the mountains or oceans that light them up. But when the conditions are right, when there's a fresh snowfall or there's a new swell coming in, they are out at the crack of dawn up to get theirs. And so think about that for a moment. No nagging, no pleading, no juvenile detention officer, no parent bribing them, no college counselor, none of it worked. But you give them a chance to experience just 5 minutes of carving turns through the forest in bottomless powder, just 30 seconds really, on an actual glassy wave, and that is enough to drive their entire existence. So now how can we harness that for the rest of us? And that's fundamentally the question. So the first thing is we said not only are the notions like grit is a depletable resource. Willpower is a depletable resource. We don't have enough of it, and everybody from bosses to kids to marketers are all clawing at our very finite supply of that stuff. And by the end of every day, most of us are just depleted. We're just out of any ability to steer our ship consciously. So hacking the autotelic driver flow becomes not just a performance booster, it almost becomes a survival strategy. And if you think back to the learning styles, where we talked about hackers and dabblers and obsessives, and we said, beware of that peak moments fantasy, right? It's a fantasy, and you have to instead be like a master, which is step, plateau, step, plateau. What hacking flow, what harnessing the intrinsic motivation of flow does is it lets us keep going on those plateaus. And it provides an aspiration, it provides an anchor or reference point to why would I keep going and why would I care? Because if you think about this, and this is the dark underbelly of 10,000 hours, of tiger moms, of helicopter parents, of all those kinds of things, is that there are people that achieve excellence doing exactly that, the 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. Although, to be clear, right, Gladwell meaningfully misrepresented Anders Ericsson's original work on expert performance theory, and the reality is it's never 10,000 hours. Sometimes it's 1,000 hours, sometimes it's 20,000 hours, sometimes it's never because you suck. Sorry, kids, right? I mean, that story took off because it was such a pull yourself up by your bootstraps, Protestant work ethic kind of thing. That's one of the reasons it went viral beyond Gladwell's great storytelling. But the realities are is that when you see, violinists or ballerinas or people who are in those classically type A kind of compulsive tracks to excellence, many of them are broken, burned out husks by the time they finally get to grab the brass ring. It's why so many Olympians who get gold medals suffer depression and even lifestyle crashes in the years that follow, because they're like, oh my gosh, I was drawing down on a whole lot of other necessary parts of me to get that thing, and then that thing did not fill up everything else I've just burned through, and so they burn out. So the ability to harness flow in service of our long-term development, the ability to take 10,000 hours and maybe compress it, because we know that learning is accelerated in flow states. We know that motivation is increased in flow states. So what is it like if we take 10,000 hours and compress it to 5,000 hours? What if we take dirt bags, right, the guys just waiting for the powder day or the new swell, and turn them into samurai? Like, is harnessing the intrinsic drives and nature of flow itself a way into greatness? Which brings us to the third leg of the stool in the notion of deep embodiment, and that is fundamentally, what do we do when we realize and accept and then act on the fact that, hey, training our bodies and brains affects our hearts and minds, and that when we harness our intrinsic motivation from these states, we can do incredible stuff. So the question is how do we do that? What are the knobs and levers that let us engineer our hedonism or happiness and well-being? So not hedonism in the pejorative sense, in the sense of like spring break parties, and beer bongs and vomit on the floor, but more like hedonism in the sense of hedonia or eudaimonia, right? Our highest and best, our actual peak state and experience. And this is, I think, probably actually our most unique contribution to the field, and this is certainly the literal seed code from which the entire Flow Genome Project sprang, both in inspiration and name and intent. And this is what we would humbly call the Flow Genome Matrix. And what that means is that there is a matrix, meaning, it's a 2x2 grid that is cataloging all the different ways that, and all the different parts of our bodies and brains that impact mood, consciousness, and performance. And we basically just kind of put them all into this grid and said, isn't this interesting? There are the levers down the left-hand column, and those levers are the things that we've been talking about so far and a few others. So it's what is happening neuroelectrically in our brain. What kind of brainwave states are we? That's a lever, right? And it can go from beta to alpha to theta to delta and gamma, right? And a whole range. And each time we move through that range, we have a different lived experience. We can talk about neuroanatomy. What parts of our brain are turning on and off? What parts are firing? What parts are not firing? What parts are talking to each other? and we can tune and tweak that as well. Cardiac states. What's actually happening in our heart rate and rhythm? Most of us just have heard about like a heart rate monitor, which is really just like a glorified metronome telling us the average kind of beats. But heart rate variability tells us the quality of beats. Our heart is always fluttering around, and actually the more diverse those flutters are, the healthier we are. When we're in a stressed response, when we're getting ready to fight or flee, right, that typically becomes very straight, like a little scared rabbit. Right? And that is a very unhealthy state to stay in for a long time. When we do the kind of practices you guys are already a few weeks into, tuning and increasing our cardiac coherence, we change everything else in our nervous system, everything else in our physiology, and therefore everything else in our actual psychology and lived experience. Beyond that, our endocrine system. Do we have stress hormones ricocheting through our body and priming us to be on the edge of our seats with a hair trigger response? Or do we have reward chemicals like endorphins or anandamide? Do we have satiety or happiness or connection neurochemicals like serotonin and oxytocin? These things are there. They are not mysterious or miraculous. And when we learn to, these are the levers, right? Let's even just keep going. Beyond our endocrine system, we have our posture. So what's happening with my posture? If I stand like this, most of us, right? This is actually known. Amy Cuddy at Harvard talks about this with studying adolescent girls, the eye hunch. This is how most humans are these days. It's totally bizarre. It's going to look like mustaches and bell bottoms in another 5 years. But for now, this is the signifier of our last decade. Holding these janky ass little screens, hunched and looking over. And the smaller the screen, the more pronounced the posture. And when we take those postures, we become more submissive, we become more anxious, we become more depressed, we become less assertive. So posture, boom, everything our grandfathers used to say, head up, shoulders back, right? Eyes ahead, firm handshakes, right? These kind of motions, these kind of experiences actually shape how we are. And there's a whole host of neurokinesthetic programming we can do that affects how our brain works, that affects how we move and function, and affects how we feel. Taking it all the way down from that, from how we hold ourselves to the most basic human biological function of all, breathing. There are 3 gases, nitrogen, oxygen, and carbon dioxide in our system at all times. By changing the rate and depth and rhythms of our breathing, we change the gaseous balance of those things, which directly shapes our consciousness. It can calm us down when we're stressed out. It can prime us when we need to get amped up. It can space us out and take us to the depths of non-ordinary realms if we want to. So that whole spectrum of respiration is open and available. These are the levers. These are the knobs, which is the intensities. Can we dial things up or back? And the last 2, one would be just psychological. What kind of maps and models am I running to interpret all this data? So if we've just been talking about tuning our biology, that's fine. But what, for most of us matters even more is, how do I feel? How's my life? How are my relationships? How am I moving through the world? And what is my narrative about my movement through the world? Am I winning? Am I liked? Am I loved? Am I accepted? Am I under threat? Right? And there's actually a functional definition of post-traumatic stress, PTSD, which is fundamentally it's broken narratives. When our storytelling or meaning making of our life no longer adequately matches up to our life, we experience it as breakdown. We experience it as distress. So if we upgrade our psychological maps and models from fixed mindsets where I'm just trying to protect and defend my self-identity to growth mindsets where I'm open and I'm curious and I accept that my performance and results is a consequence of my practice and preparation, all the way into how do I become self-authoring? How do I not just start winning within the rules of the game, but how do I start writing new rules for my game? How do I start writing chapters of my life that haven't been written yet? And so these are some of the ideas that are possible. These are the big levers, right? These are the things that we can intervene with. The knobs is how do we tune them? And when we tune them, if you take a look at this chart, right? Basically, if you take a look at the left-hand side versus the right-hand side, the left-hand side is more or less where 21st century normal lives. That's where most of us are spending most of our time. The right-hand side is the realm of optimal possibility. It's the realm of non-ordinary states. It's the zip code for ecstasis. And it is certainly where we go hunting flow. And once we know that, it demystifies our efforts to engage in hedonic engineering. We can now aim for a known target instead of firing blind. So once we have the matrix to serve almost like a Rosetta Stone, it literally lets us decode language that was otherwise hieroglyphic. Right? It gives us choices, and then we can take radical responsibility for our own awareness and for our own states. And we don't have to become dependent on sugar or alcohol or media or Facebook, right? Or sales campaigns to jank us around and pluck our strings without us knowing. So cognitive liberty is one of the invitations and possibilities here. And cognitive liberty means nothing more nor less than I am educated and literate about the functioning of my neurophysiology, and I am aware as to who, with or without my consent, is trying to grab those knobs and tune my life. And the idea is fundamentally that endopharmacology, the idea that we have the ability to tune our states internally. And what we produce in our bodies, our own bodies and brains, is infinitely healthier, more effective, more potent, and more enjoyable than anything we can get off a counter or on a street corner. So this notion of cognitive liberty means reclaiming our birthright to own and tune our own awareness. And that is the beginning of a very fun adventure.